Peji said, the poetry is all about challenging the simplicity. Simple is a word that comes from Latin singulus, single. No, we are plural, we're not single. And to show that plurality, we have today with us Victor Rodriguez Nunez. Please come on stage. Victor was born in Havana, in Cuba. He is one of the Cuba's most outstanding and celebrated contemporary writers, with over 80 collections of his poetry published throughout the world. He has been the recipient of major awards in Spanish-speaking region. His selected poems have been translated into over a dozen languages. Among them is the last is coming up in Bangla. That I happen to be in charge of that project with my team, and he divides his time between Gambier, Ohio, where he's a professor of Spanish at Kenyon College, and Havana in Cuba. Next up is Catherine M. Heading, is a prize-winning translator. Please come on stage, Cathy. The latest translations include collections by Juan Calzadilla, Antonio Gamoneda, Fina Garcia Marruz, Raúl Gómez Jatin. She's the co-editor with Welsh poet Zoe Scolding of the groundbreaking Transatlantic Translation Anthology, Poetry's Geographies. She is a managing editor of Action Books. She resides in Ohio, where she is a professor of Spanish at Kenyon College and in Havana, Cuba. Next up is Dulce Chiang. She comes from Mexico. Poet, performing artist, and cultural manager. She has a degree in literary creation and has published 4 books of poems, as well as poetry in numerous international anthologies. Editor of El Golem Digital Literary Magazine, director of International Festival of Women's Poetry, Vértice Violeta, held yearly in Mexico City, and the director of Center for Literary Creation, Javier Villaurrutia, of the National Literature Coordination of the National Institute of Fine Arts and Literature of Mexico. Our next panelist is Rey Berroa. He comes from Dominican Republic, has authored more than 60 books of poems, anthologies, and literary criticism. Son Palomas Mensajeras, Bolivia 2023 is his latest book. El Cuerpo Hendido, Poéticas de la M. Paternidad, México, MP. Paternidad, Mexico 2020. Book of Fragments, Kolkata 1992. Recognitions: the Dominican Book Fair of New York dedicated to his work in 2014, the Trieste International Poetry Award in 2011, and Mihai Eminescu Prize, Cracovia, Romania 2012. Since 1992, he coordinates the Poetry Marathon, Washington, D.C., and co-founded the World Poetry Day Festival in 2022. A warm welcome to all of our panelists. And this session is about Latin American poetry. So I have a question, being a reader of Latin American poetry for more than 20 years now. So I would ask a question to all of you. Is there a Latin American poetry? Please answer one by one.
Yes.
Define shortly.
No doubt about that. Yeah.
Please.
Well, Dulce said yes, and I will say the same thing. Our history is very peculiar in the way that from the beginning, when our people struggle against the colonialism, we want to be just one nation. Even from Simon Bolivar, the dream of Bolivar, that we were just one nation, you know. And after that, we have struggled against nationalism, you know, and we even, I think that people who believe that Latin America is just one country, they beat the nationalism very bad, because we want to keep our unity at the same time our diversity. Something that is more relevant right now in Latin America is that there are more and more poetry written in the original languages, not only in Spanish or Portuguese or French or English or all those languages that were colonial languages, but we use the Spanish to keep the unity, and we can use the languages, you know, the original language to keep the diversity. Diversity and unity are not, are false opposites. They are false binaries. Binaries. Okay. You know, Fidel Castro's spirit. And
Yes. We were expecting a marathon from you. That's it. Please, Dulce.
Is it open? Okay. So I think I agree with Victor on the importance of the original languages, the pre-Hispanic languages, because Latin America has written Spanish since the colonialism, and we are getting back there. Also, I want to point out that there is an important amount of poetry written and acknowledged by women, because women write poetry but haven't been acknowledged until now. So, and besides adding both original language plus poetry written by women, it's been a movement lately. I organize a poetry festival that acknowledge women written poetry, not only from Mexico, but from all Latin America, and we invite some other women poets from other languages. But we made a point on original languages from Mexico, from Latin America, and from other countries also have antique languages. So I think that is a helmet of the world that must be kept. It mustn't be filtered from time. So yes, there is a Latin American poetry and Latin American literature, because our backgrounds are common, but are also diverse. We are diverse, but we have this history in common, and that is what fits our poetry, and that is what we transmit in our poetry. As Rapin said, that poetry is what you write, but also what it comes behind you, and our history, our backgrounds, our original customs, our myths are also common. So yeah, how couldn't there be a Latin American poetry or narrative or literary movement? There is, and again, maybe I'm being repeated, but that is like my goal in the world: acknowledge women work in literature too. Thank you.
Now, Ray Berroa, like I must say one word. He's from Dominican Republic. That's the oldest uh, island where, well, that's the island where Christopher Columbus arrived. So he is literally from the the island which is called Española. So he represents the oldest Spanish speakers among the Latin Americans.
All of the above. Thank you very much.
Oh,
I am not from Latin America, but I am a scholar of Latin American poetry, so I would like to say a few things as well. I would say that there's a Latin American poetry, but there are Latin American poetries. One of the things, in its plurality, very important to recognize, just as Dulce and Victor have said, and Ray, very
ratified.
ratified.
Put the seal.
That there is a commonality, but within that commonality, there are many differences. One of the things for me that is so important about contemporary Latin American poetries is their openness to the world. There is not an insularism. There is a desire to know beyond the borders, and there's a lot of sharing, a lot of collaboration, and this is also an important part of Latin America. Latin America doesn't want just to be Latin America. It wants to be open to the world, and we see that a lot in much of the poetry that's written right now.
No, yeah. Let me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Or do you need the microphone for recording?
For the recording, I believe yes.
So let me add to that something that I think is very important in the recognition that Dulce wanted to stress. The amount of poetry festivals that had opened up that we didn't have in the past. In fact, a Dominican poet asked me, why do you think that there are so many poetry festivals everywhere? Because the public, the people, have a hunger to listen to their poets, a way of filling up this vacuum that politicians, religious leaders, which are despicable most of the times, have created a vacuum of imagination. The poets have created the gods, and the politicians grab the gods to deceive the people, to deceive the reality in which we live. And that's precisely, I think, that, I went to Medellin and I couldn't believe what happened there. I went to Mexico and you go to a poetry reading, have 800 people. I went to Turkey to celebrate Latin American poetry with Ataol Veramolu. I don't know if some of you know Ataol. And I couldn't believe it was a room filled with Turks that wanted to hear Latin American poetry because it was dedicated. 8 poets from Latin America went there, and I feel so honored that I was one of those 8 people that they chose. There were many other poets with much more recognition, but for whichever reason, I had been in Venezuela the year before, and they published an anthology of my work, and it sold out the same day that it appeared. And the poets asked me, why do you think that is? And I had no idea why people wanted to acquire that anthology. And that's the reason why I imagine that's the reason why I was invited to go to Turkey. And for a poet to be invited to go to Izmir, the land of Homer, the beginning of the imagination, it was like a pilgrimage. That for me was much more important than going to Jerusalem or to Mecca. It is the land of Homer that creates this sense. So in Medellin, for those of you who have not been in Medellin, the first day of the reading is made in this little mountain in the city, and it rains, and every year it rains the first day of the reading. And those 10,000 people listening to the poets, nobody leaves. They simply open their umbrellas and stay there with their buttocks filled with water. And a poet, a Swedish poet next to me with tears in his eyes asked me, Ray, why are they staying? Because the poets are protected with the roof. The people are not. It shouldn't be the other way around. And I said, I have no idea, but let's ask. So after the poetry after the reading, I went to a young girl that was there, 17, 18 years of age, and I asked, it rained cats and dogs, and nobody left. Why did you stay? And the girl said, Ray, we waited the whole year for this moment. No one, no guts, no action of the gods was going to deprive us from listening to our
That's the spirit of transformation, generally, wherever you go. So I would now dissect a little the plurality of Latin American literature. So let me begin with Victor. What is the Cuban scenario of Latin American poetry now?
Well, we all have some difference among of every poetry. For instance, Cuban poetry has its own dynamic, but at the same time, it's open to what Mexican poetry is producing, or we don't see each other like a Mexican poet or a Dominican poet. We think that we belong to just one poet. I think that's important. In Cuba, there is a really very strong tradition of poetry, and this tradition is very, very, very alive. I like a lot the production of the new generation of poets. They are poets that not only read in internet, they read books, and even the limitation that in Cuba they have about the access to internet, they keep that, convert that in a victory instead of a defeat. You know, something that is in favor, and there are really, really a very huge plurality of voices, many different of style. You cannot say that there is just one style, because there are some of them that write prose poems, others are close to the song, others are have approach to different traditions, and they show that diversity, you know. And I don't know.
No, but the thing is, from India, we sometimes think about Cuban social poetry. So your poets have completely changed the scenario. Tell us about it.
Well, Cuba, we for when the Cuban Revolution, the victory of the Cuban Revolution, we don't want to be another socialist country. But it's a different project. You know, the Communist Party in Cuba was against Fidel Castro and his movement. Even Khrushchev ordered to kill Fidel Castro. And the guy who was the general secretary of the Communist Party in Cuba ended up his life in jail because the government discovered the plot. And in certain moment, Cuba took, you know, the alienation of the Soviet Union. They broke with China. It's a very complex history. Like everything, there is nothing simple. Everything is complicated. And for the late 60s to during the 70s and the 80s, we copied the Soviet way to do a revolution, do a social change, and that was a big mistake. One of the things in the packet was the social realism. In Cuba, we had social realism before the revolution. They were poets who wrote social realism, and that was okay. We not reject social realism. We reject social realism as a only option of writing a revolutionary poem. You know, we said, Nicolas Guillen, what you did was awesome, but we don't want to do the same thing. and being see that just as a tendency will okay with us. I belong to a generation that we fought against the imposition of social realism to us, and what we basically did is, fortunately, Ernesto Che Guevara was against social realism, and we have the support, of Che's arguments against social realism. But we spent I think the half of the 80s fighting against the social realism, and I think we prevailed. Even there was the Minister of Culture have a meeting with us and say, well, don't talk more about social realism. You wait, okay? That's over. But that doesn't mean that our poetry was less social. To write about social, there are many ways. Poetry is always social. There is no way that you can produce a poetry that is not social. It's a redundancy to say social poetry. And because for instance, in my generation is the first generation where the majority of the poets in my generation were women, and women, they start writing about the issues. They were other issues about sexuality, other issues about ethnicity that were discussed in our poetry. And basically, we produced a poetry that was more related and more faithful and more realistic about our society than the social realism.
This is the thing that when I started reading Cuban poetry, like from that perspective of getting the Latin American social reality, I stumbled there, and it was like a new thing for me. I discovered a poet whose name is Jose Lezama Lima, and he was quite a kind of underground poet because his imagination. He's the father of Neo Barroco. So this is a Neo Baroque movement in Latin America. So he started. He's probably the key beginner of that resistance against all kind of social poetry in that point of time because he was contemporary of social Cuban revolution.
He is before the revolution. When the revolution won in the 1959, he was basically half the majority of his work already published. And he has some kind of sympathy for the Cuban Revolution. He could leave and he stayed there. And he always saw poetry as a resistance. That's the mission. He never wanted to be an official poet. Poetry, he received all kind of offer when he published in the 40s, late 40s and the 50s, published the very important cultural magazine, Orígenes. He refused to accept any help from the state, even though they were so poor and so they embraced poverty as the poetry condition. And there's something is related with they were very deep Christians, and they were against the Catholic Church, but they were Christians. They were part of the liberation theology movement in Latin America, redefining what was the role of being Christian in a place like Latin America. And he never wanted to be an official poet. He was marginalized during the revolution because he was not communist. That was okay with him. He was not gay. That's a thing that nobody knows if he was gay or not. He wrote a famous chapter he wrote a novel, Paradiso, that is an amazing novel. And there is a chapter about, a homosexual relationship. but that was not exactly proof. There were other writers of his generation, of his group, that were openly gay, like Virgilio Piñera. But he was not gay. He never project himself about the term to build a sexual homosexual identity. Okay, is what I really.
In that period of time, there was a woman poet, Dulce Maria Loinas. I must quote her a line that is with me ever since I read. I roughly translated: "Snow is the water tired of running." This is pure wisdom. This is pure wisdom. And now I must switch to Dulce to talk about the Mexican portrait.
Well, currently in Mexico we have several groups of poets that get together to support each other as a group and to support each other between groups. And it happens in Mexico City, which is the capital city, but also in the States. And there are several, as Ray said, several poetry festivals to have feedback between them, but not only inside Mexico or between Mexico states, but also with poets from other countries. So it is very common that, like in this festival, there is feedback from other countries that come to Mexico, mainly of poets that have been translated to Spanish. Well, something that Crystal said is that the translation work is it's on place right now because, as Ray said again, we want to hear several truths and we speak the truth by the poetry. That is why everybody wants to hear it. So we have lots of magazines as well, literary magazines that are mainly online because after the COVID pandemic, that everybody was on their houses, everybody realized that one thing that you could do really well when you are alone and in silence and not interchanging with other human beings is poetry. So lots of electronic magazines and electronic festivals came up, and practically there are literary activities every day. Well, I work on that, and it's my responsibility that they are. And we are we're working as well on public calling. We take the poets to the universities and to schools, so people are get in touch with literature since a young age, and that creates people who readers, because that is something, we are fighting against electronic contents. So in one hand we have to be an electronic content, but electronic contents are very are short, and people who read them are short too. Sometimes, I mean, in deepness of thoughts. So that is what we have to fight against, to be to get to inner parts of the minds of people. So we do public readings all the time, not only official and government funded readings and cycles, but also independent groups cycles. There are lots of them, and there are lots of independent publications as well, not only internet but also in fanzines. There are lots of fanzines that are cheap forms of publishing, and they run everywhere. So between groups and between festivals and between among publication, there is a lot of movement right now.
This is very interesting for me to see in Mexico. The universities, they run magazines and among them a very famous magazine run by the largest Mexican university. It's called Periódico de Poesía. This is in Mexico National University. They run